Welcome everybody at this lecture, this session. We have 75 minutes. Before I introduce the speaker of the EJ lecture, I would like to give the floor to Martin Cripps.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to award the prizes the Royal Society gives. The first one I need to talk about, is that better? Yes. Is the Austin Robinson Prize. And that was established by the RES to honor one of its most dedicated servants. It says here students, but I'm pretty sure he was a servant. He worked for 36 years for the Economic Society, both as assistant editor of the EJ and as secretary of the Society. And the prize is awarded by the editors of the EJ to the best paper by an author who's less than 5 years out of their PhD. So this year, the prize goes to, drum roll please, La La Land. Sorry. No, sorry. It goes to Sergei Nigai for his paper on measuring the welfare gains from trade under consumer heterogeneity. So this is everything you could want in a paper when you see it as an editor. It's beautifully written, clear, with powerful conclusions, and looking at an important question. And it provides a new critique of representative agent models that are used in trade, showing that these trade models, which are mainly used by policymakers, badly bias our estimates of the gains from trade. Sergei develops quite a sophisticated GE model of the consumption channel. He has heterogeneous agents which are heterogeneous in 2 dimensions across their incomes and across their marginal propensities to consume, and 93 countries and 3 sectors. And in that context, he shows that the consumption channel alone will lead us to substantially overestimate the gains the poor experience from trade, which is clearly an important political and social problem. So, Sergei Nigai. On to the other prize I have to award today. I'm sorry for rushing. This is the Economic Journal Prize, and it's awarded to the best paper in the EJ in a given year. And a committee consisting of myself, Andrew Cheshire and Ian Preston decided that the prize this year should be awarded to Dan Anderberg, Helmut Rayner, Jonathan Wadsworth, and Tanya Wilson for their paper, Unemployment, Domestic Violence, Theory and Evidence. Okay? So their paper is quite a clever piece of work because it uses theory to allow us to uncover something that we didn't know was there before. So, which I approve of. Okay. So if you just looked at the relationship between unemployment and domestic violence, you'd find a negligible relationship between those two. But what this paper does is then thinks about men and women separately and uses economic theory and a very good microdata from the British Crime Survey to reveal a hidden relationship. In the theory part of the paper, they show that domestic violence should decline with male unemployment, but increase with female unemployment. That's coming from a theoretical model of inter-household negotiation, I suppose. And then they take this to the data, and they find evidence supporting this relationship, something that we didn't know before. It's a remarkable piece of structural modeling, combining theory and data in a novel and useful way. So Dan and Tanya are going to come up and collect pieces of paper.
Okay, it's a great honor for me to introduce the presenter of this year's Economic Journal lecture, Hilary Hoynes. Hilary Hoynes is a professor of public policy and economics and has the Haas Distinguished Chair in Economic Disparities at Berkeley. She's a leading thinker on economic policy and has done path-breaking work on the economics of tax and transfer programs for low-income populations. In particular, she has made major contributions to the evaluation of programs to reduce poverty. Now, this is important work because these programs are huge, but it's also very interesting academically because the work goes much deeper than just estimating average treatment effects. She was one of the first to pay a lot of attention to the underlying mechanisms, heterogeneity of effects, effects on inequality, policy design in turbulent conditions, and what is particularly imminent at the moment is, problems with the take-up or the lack of take-up of programs, and to the extent to which this is due to stigma or to lack of transparency of the programs. So recently, Hilary Hoynes has done a lot of work on the effects of early life access to social security, to social safety nets and early education on health, abilities, and human capital. And we are delighted that she will share with us some of her path-breaking work on that. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's been a really lovely couple of days. And I really appreciate being offered the opportunity to talk with you today. So the title of my lecture is The Long Run Effects of the Social Safety Net. And it was actually in our session, the special session we were in yesterday, that I was thinking about the right way to motivate this talk. And it seems particularly relevant to Gerard introducing me and to being in the UK right now, to be thinking about the sort of origins of this rich set of studies that have taken place over the past couple of decades that in a broad way are looking at and trying to evaluate the effects of early life conditions, particularly gestational exposure to various kinds of risks, and trying to translate that and quantify the effects on that in the long run. And of course, there was the early work, kind of path-breaking work by Barker, epidemiologists, looking at the relationship and asserting this sort of programming of the fetus that occurs in utero, that a lot of the early work was done through the study of famines. And so the general finding was that children that were born and were in utero during a time of severe nutritional deprivation, come adulthood, sort of post-reproductive age, had higher risks of metabolic syndrome like obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, and so on. And that then was sort of introduced into economics and within our discipline really grown under the work of Gerard and many others, studying and pushing the literature to look beyond famines and to look at a wide variety of kinds of insults to early life, infectious diseases, environmental factors, public health improvements, the environment, and so on. And furthermore, also showed that these health conditions that were worse in the long run if nutrition was bad, also extended to economic well-being and things that we're more used to studying and analyzing, like education and earnings and poverty and all sorts of that whole kind of constellation of those outcomes. And so that's a very well-established, very rich literature. And I was thinking sometime not that long ago that this is really relevant in a much broader sense. And so there were some questions that literature sort of teed up for me that motivated some of the work I'm going to tell you about, which is not just my work, but work by others that sort of fits under this umbrella of the long-run effects of exposure to the social safety net. But in relationship to this fetal origins early life literature, I think there are three things that these studies do. One, they move us beyond sort of extreme shocks like famines to analyze more moderate kinds of interventions and changes. Number two, we move away from these very clear nutritional channels like famines towards even asking about things like broader distribution of income. Or I'm going to tell you about some work that actually relates to expanding health insurance when children are young, very far from the sort of original nutritional channel and our understanding that kind of derived from it. So that's one thing, moderate as opposed to extreme. The second sort of innovation that I'll be talking about is moving beyond just thinking about this sort of biological in utero exposure and to think about what the long run effects are of these interventions in childhood rather than just in utero, because most of the policies that we're often thinking about are policies that are aimed at children or families with children. And so the question is, well, are these beneficial effects of interventions, do they go beyond just that biological period of the 9 months in utero? And then the third thing that really tees up why I'm talking to you about this is that I'm interested in these social safety net policies. And after all, these are things that government policy can do a good job of manipulating, certainly a lot easier than manipulating famine or weather conditions. And so there's something that we can learn from thinking about policy manipulation of these factors that can potentially improve outcomes in the long run. So that's the sort of relationship to a literature that very much predates what I'm going to be talking about today, but sort of tees it up in interest. And so the broad question that I'm interested in trying to ask is, can we think about the social safety net as an investment rather than just thinking about it as current period redistribution? And so what I want to talk to you about is now it's a relatively young literature, but a growing literature where we're learning more about to what extent providing more social welfare, social safety net spending aimed at children can be then quantified in terms of beneficial effects in the long run, beneficial health effects, economic effects, and so on. And in some of the studies, we're able to say something not only about does it matter, but when does it matter? Does it matter whether we're providing more social welfare spending when a child is 1 or 3 or 10 or 15? Are there returns, and do the returns differ depending on when we're doing the investment, which of course has very clear kinds of policy predictions for, say, how you might want to structure a child allowance, whether you might want to structure a child allowance that is larger in value when a child is young and maybe smaller, if in fact the returns are larger when the child is young. So there's, I think, a lot more to learn. But I thought this was a good time to sort of share with you what I think we know at this point. And to scope that down a little bit, I'm going to be focusing on the social safety net, in particular that's targeted to disadvantaged families. So not Social Security, which is universal, but redistribution-based policies, and in particular those that are targeted at children or families with children, to kind of scope this problem down a little bit. And to scope it down a little bit further, I'm going to talk about the evidence for programs in the US. And there's not the only set of evidence that's out there. And in fact, yesterday, I saw another new paper in a session I was in yesterday. So over time, I'll try to do a better job of expanding this to policies and evidence coming from other countries. But that's what I'm going to talk about today to try to create some kind of coherence. And so with that, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about different elements of the social safety net in the US context in order to try to fit in place what I'm going to be sharing with you today. But before doing that, in order to do this kind of an analysis of estimating the returns to social safety net investments when kids are young, we sort of need three things. In fact, just as a bit of a side comment, very oddly, last night I got an email from a New York Times reporter saying, I'm thinking about writing a story to try to push against the Republican narrative that the social safety net is a hammock. That's basically what our Speaker of the House, it's like the shorthand. Social safety nets are hammocks. In other words, they make you lazy, you like slump down, and you don't engage in the labor market. And he said, I hear you're doing some work on this, and I literally just Skyped with him like a half an hour ago. I said, well, that's crazy. I'm like actually talking about this afternoon, and have put some thoughts together. It was kind of an interesting timing, but he said to me at the end of the call, like, why are we only just learning about this now? And I think part of the reason is the kind of data revolution and the availability of registry data. That's one piece. Of course, we always need to have a good design to do the identification. That's not changed. So we need to have a design in order to have the kind of the first stage, if you will, about the policy treatment that we're looking at. But what we also need is time. You know, by definition, to evaluate the long-run effects of something, we need to wait some time to measure them. And it just kind of happens that we're sort of at this point right now where there's a lot of research about policies that expanded in the 90s, which was a big period of expansion of a social safety net in the US. And then another set of studies, and so there the children are now sort of in young adulthood. So that's good. You know, once they get past education, there's a whole bunch of stuff we can measure that's harder to do when they're just in the sort of primary, secondary school world. And then there's another set of studies that go back to the kind of earlier stage of expansion of many elements of the US social safety net, which was back in the 60s and 70s. And those studies are able to look at individuals sort of in middle adulthood, like my age, in your mid-50s. And so obviously you need to have some basic elements in order to sort of do this work. And so part of it, I think, is that we're kind of at a good time in order to do these evaluations. So to sort of tee up the context in which I'm going to be describing these results, what I have up here is just the trend in the poverty rate in the US over the history of measuring poverty in the US. And the green line is a sort of comprehensive post-tax and transfer measure of poverty that indeed also includes sort of in-kind transfers like food stamps and includes the tax system through the in-work program, the earning of tax credit, and so on. And the black line, just for a point of reference, calculates what you might call market-based poverty. In other words, pre-tax, pre-transfer, but assuming no behavioral change, just literally kind of mechanically zeroing out all of the income levels and transfers that are there and recalculating poverty, just as some kind of measure of what the social safety net is doing on a period-by-period basis. And so what you can see from this is that, you know, the gap between those two lines, or as shown in the gray bars, is pretty large. The US social safety net, while not as generous as many countries on this side of the Atlantic, still does do a lot of work in reducing poverty. And you can particularly see that in the Great Recession, with that dramatic increase in market-based poverty, you see a much smoother rate, which of course that's what a social safety net is for, in part, to smooth out those fluctuations. So, and one thing that sort of jumps out at you of looking at this graph is that sort of over time that's trended downward. And the part of the discussion in the US is that we put all these money into social safety net programs, but nothing ever changes. Poverty rates are really high. Well, it turns out that our official poverty measure in the US is actually a cash-based pre-tax income poverty measure, which is not the green line, and I don't have it on this slide, but essentially all of the growth of the US social safety net has been either through the tax system or through in-kind benefits like food stamps and health insurance and food and nutrition programs. And so it's really not a fair, that's not the right measure to use, this sort of outmoded cash-based pre-tax poverty measure, but it's very political, so it's very hard to move away from it. But the green line is sort of a bit of a victory because the census now releases this, what's called the supplemental poverty measure, every year on the same day that they release the official poverty measure. It's just not official poverty. but it's useful because we can all agree on what these programs are sort of doing. Just for context, this green line does the same calculation, but calculates the number of people who have incomes below 50% of this absolute poverty threshold. And of course, that number is going to be lower by definition, but the point is to show that we haven't made much progress on that. And that's sort of a talk for another day, but essentially the US doesn't do much out-of-work assistance anymore. And most of the benefits are operating through sort of in-work benefits. And so the sort of poorest of the poor have been sort of left behind. But that's not the topic for today. So if you take this sort of gray bar and say, well, which programs are doing what? Can we unpack this decline in poverty and where it's coming from? This does that tabulation, that exercise, just for child poverty, because that's what I'm interested in talking about today. And what you can see is that the Earned Income Tax Credit, or our in-work support program, is the biggest anti-poverty program for children in the United States. So just as a simple static calculation, it removes almost 5 million children from poverty. And you can see that the second most important program is the food stamp program, and you can sort of see the others. So in my discussion today about what we know about the long-run effects of the social safety net, the three areas where the most work has been done is on sort of cash assistance, and I'll have kind of several different examples of that. I would say the EITC is an example of that, although it's through the tax system. So I'm going to tell you about some evidence there. I'm going to tell you about some evidence on the food stamp program. And then I'm also going to talk about public health insurance, the Medicaid program, which provides health insurance for public health insurance for low-income families in the US, where there's been actually an amazing expansion even before Obamacare and everything that came with it. So I'm going to talk about those three different sets of body of work. And I've sort of organized them to go from pure cash to the farthest from cash in terms of the discussion. So starting with cash assistance, and where that big bar on that bar chart, the Earned Income Tax Credit is the biggest anti-poverty program for children in the US. It provides, essentially an earnings subsidy for earnings up to about $15,000. You can see that on the chart on the left, which just shows you the actual benefit schedule for our in-work program. And the key parameters of a program like that are just what the phase-in rate is. And the phase-in rate in the US context is pretty high. So for example, a woman or a family with 2 children, the slope of that first segment is 40%. So you earn $1 and you get 40 cents back through the tax system. And so that's your kind of wage subsidy or earnings subsidy part of the schedule. And eventually the credit, which say maximizes at about $5,500 for a family with 2 children, which the poverty threshold for a 3-person family with 2 children is about $18,000. So it's it's almost a third of the poverty threshold. So it's not small. It's could be bigger, but it's not small. And then these credits are phased out, and the phase-out rate is the other key parameter. How severely are you going to phase it out, or are you going to phase it out sort of smoothly? And sort of in response to all the evidence from the cash welfare world where benefits are tend to be phased out very quickly, with estimated sort of distortive effects of that, the EITC is phased out more gradually at about 21 cents on the dollar, so a 21% phase-out rate. So that's what you kind of have on the left. And on the right-hand side, you can see the evolution of the generosity of the credit just measured by its maximum value over time. And then there's these kind of demarcations of the different tax policy bills that passed that expanded the credit over time. And our tax system is set in adjustments for changes in prices. So in between any tax changes, the program would be constant in real terms. So, as I have up there, other countries have in-work credits, notably here. And so this is something that's growing in a lot of places. About more than 40% of single parent, families with children who file taxes receive the earned income tax credit. So it reaches a lot of people, or 20% of all tax filers. So it's quite important. So the sort of upstream evidence on the EITC is that it encourages a lot of work on the extensive margins. So when the program is implemented or expands, you gain quite significant amounts of employment, labor force participation. There's not a lot of evidence of a sort of discouragement effect of the intensive margin that the phase-out rate suggests there should be. And there's a lot of kind of interesting work about why that might be. And at the end of the day, this work encouragement effect accounts for about as much anti-poverty effectiveness as the cash transfer itself, as the fact that you're giving out the EITC. So that 4.8 million children who were reduced from poverty actually underestimates the effect by half. That is, if you also count the behavioral response of increased earnings, you actually gain almost twice as much anti-poverty effectiveness. So it's a way of quantifying the labor supply effect. It's large. So that's the upstream effect. Here's a program, we know it does two things. It sends more moms to the labor market and distributes a lot of income in the process. And so there's now a sort of second generation of work that is evaluating what that additional income does. And there's a couple of studies that look at effects on health. And neither of these studies are really rigidly long-term studies, but I think they speak to us trying to understand some mechanisms of what might lead to long-term effects of distribution early on. And so there's this one excellent study by Bill Evans and Craig Garthwaite that uses data on the moms, on women, and including biomarker data, and finds that using a good quasi-experimental research design that's been sort of tried and true in the upstream literature, using variation across tax reforms and family size, essentially, finds that when women who are exposed to a higher earned income tax credit, their risky biomarkers improve. And so, we've known for a long time that these, like cortisol and other stress elements, are at much higher rate in low SES individuals compared to higher SES individuals. But there's not that many good studies that show that it can be causally, that you can causally manipulate that through SES or income in this case itself. So I think that's quite an important finding. I did some work with my co-authors Doug Miller and David Simon that looked at national registry data on women that are pregnant and used that same sort of tried and true research design around having access to more or less generous earned income tax credit, and then look at what happens to the births of those kids. And you can see in this figure, a sort of summary figure from our analysis, what we're tracing out here is the propensity to have a low birth weight birth. And the control group are women on their first birth, because the tax system relates to how many kids you have when you're before the kid is born. And so you basically don't have any EITC when it's your first birth. And we compare women who are having a second and a third or higher order birth compared to women having a first birth. And we look at the changes in the propensity to have a low birth weight birth in the periods leading up to and after the 1993 expansion in the earned income tax credit. And you can see that 1991, 1992, 1993, it looks as though the propensity to have a low birth weight birth is trending quite similarly across the treatment and the control groups. But what you can see is that the propensity to have a low birth weight birth declines significantly for women who are exposed to this greater EITC. And it declines more for women who are having a third birth or later, who actually experienced a much larger expansion because of the nature of the tax reform and the expansion than women who were pregnant with their second birth. And so this sort of ordering of the larger effect for the red line compared to the blue line is completely consistent with the expansions of the credit. So we have a policy that's delivering more income through an in-work sort of tax credit that translates into improved health, child health at birth. You know, this isn't a long-term outcome per se, but we know that it's a kind of measurable and important channel that correlates, though doesn't completely explain what we observe in the long run. So it's kind of an important marker to talk about. So there's this work on the EITC in health. And then there's another set of studies that look at the EITC in, you know, human capital in some way. So there's the sort of older Dahl and Lochner paper that looks at test scores for kids. That's contemporaneous, not long-term. But now there's a sort of second set of studies that is looking at sort of completed educational attainment, completing high school, and the propensity to enter college, and how that relates to exposure in childhood to having a greater or a lesser earned income tax credit. And different studies using slightly different research designs find consistently improvements in educational attainment with a greater EITC. And this is one study by De Manoli and what's his first name? Nick Turner, that look at in a sort of regression kink design and use data to look at the propensity to enter higher education and the relationship to the incentives that the family received in the earned income tax credit. So it's one of the examples of this literature that generally shows that more generous social welfare payment leads to higher rates of educational attainment. So a quite different intervention and a really important paper is a much more historical one. So of course, you know, to look at these longer run outcomes, you need to go further back in time. And the work by Anna Iser and the many co-authors I have listed here, which was published recently, analyzes a program that was actually of the very early stages of the social welfare state in America. And there were these state-level programs in the teens, in 1910, 1920, that predated the Social Security Act, which was in 1935, sort of the beginning of the social safety net in America. And these programs predated that. And Anna and her co-authors do this amazing job where they do this archival work and manage to find the documents that indicated on an individual basis women who would come into the office to get pension payments, cash welfare, and whether or not they were given the benefit or whether they were determined to be ineligible. And there was a lot of interesting work about what it might have meant to be ineligible with that bias towards finding a positive effect or a negative effect, et cetera, et cetera. You'll read the paper to get the details. But they then mine all the administrative data, including World War II enlistment records and height, as well as mortality, because, you know, 100 years have passed. And most of these people, these are the children of the mothers that they're analyzing. And what they find is quite dramatic increases by this kind of treatment control comparison of the group that received the benefits versus those that were determined to be ineligible, but then they follow them over time. And they find that those that received the pension as a child lived longer, had higher education levels, had a reduced probability of being underweight for the boys, for the World War II enlistment records, and had increased income in adulthood by 14%. They weren't really powered up to full disclosure. I handled this paper as an editor at the AER, so I pushed them to tell me about whether time of exposure mattered, because I have this interest in trying to understand whether it matters whether you get benefits when you're younger and older. They did that. They weren't really powered up to do that particularly well. The point estimates suggest larger effects if kids were treated earlier, but they weren't statistically different from being treated later. So it's kind of limited in terms of what we can learn about that. So this has been, I think, a really important result, that we have surprisingly little evidence about the effects of these programs in the long run. So before shifting to food stamps, one program that isn't a program, but some really interesting work going on right now is, you may or may not know that there are many American Indian tribes in the United States, and there's been this sort of innovation that these different groups are allowed to have casino gambling on their property. And most casino gambling is something that's regulated at the state level. So for example, in my state of California, there's no gambling allowed, but American Indian groups that live within California on their own lands can do casino gambling. And there's this very interesting research agenda that has come out of a sort of fortuitous study that was in the field in rural North Carolina, where it turned out it was a study they were studying Native American and other rural populations in North Carolina. And it just so happened that the main Native American tribe there opened a casino during the time of their investigation, and created this kind of demogrant policy where they redistributed the profits of the casino on a per capita basis to the population. And so there's a handful of studies that have sort of analyzed this. It's basically a cohort design using non-Native Americans as a control group. So you're comparing kids that where this new income disbursement came in when you were an older or a younger child. That's one dimension. And then with non-Native Americans as sort of a control group. And there's a lot of different papers that this kind of design is coming out with, but they seem to show, the one that's most relevant to this conversation is that more years of exposure to this additional benefit in childhood leads to higher rates of education and lower rates of criminality. So it sort of fits under this broad speaking about, and it's a pretty disadvantaged population, to be sure. So, it's very kind of anecdote, it's an eclectic bundle of what we know because it's the studies that are available, but it's quite, I think, revealing about the possibilities of having returns to basic social welfare interventions when kids are young. So I've done a bunch of work on this kind of strange US program called food stamps, which really is just another version of a cash assistance program, except that households don't receive cash, they receive food vouchers, which now are, actually were vouchers back in the day, but now all is distributed through debit cards. And individuals can use those. It's an ordinary sort of social welfare program in the sense that your benefit is maximized if you have no income, and it's phased out as your income increases. But it's phased out at a 30% phase-out rate, whereas typical cash assistance in the United States is typically phased out at like 100% phase-out rate. So it's a program that feeds a lot of, it wasn't meant to be a double statement, but provides benefits to the working poor as well as the non-working poor. So because of the phase-out that's a little bit more gradual. So this program, interestingly, is a national program. Most redistributive programs in the US have a lot of variation across states and their implementation. Food stamps is a national program, and it's not changed very much over time. So even though we had welfare reform and all these other kind of contractions of our basic cash-like social safety net, food stamps was able to maintain itself through all of that. And so we don't have a lot of good designs to evaluate food stamps because it doesn't vary across areas and it hasn't varied a lot over time. So you probably haven't read many papers that analyze the effects of food stamps. So with some co-authors, with Diane Schanzenbach and Doug Almond, we've done a bunch of work that leverages the historical origins of the food stamp program, which, due to kind of interesting political and bureaucratic reasons, was rolled out across counties in the US over about a 15-year period. So from the very first counties that got access to food stamps in the early 1960s to the last counties that got access in the mid-1970s, there was a lot of variation. You know, you'll have to read the details of the paper to be convinced whether it's exogenous variation or not, but it seems to be. And you can see here, you know, counties are pretty small in the United States. There's like almost 3,200 counties in the United States. And this just shows the it doesn't show up all that well up here, but it shows the sort of variation in the timing of the rollout. Some states organized all the counties together to sort of put in an application to get this benefit, and the whole state came online at one time. But that was a little bit of an exception. There's a lot of variation, even within states, a lot of spatial variation in this policy. And the first study that we did that's sort of relevant to this longer run impact looked at the effects on low birth weight. So very similar in terms of its kind of motivation to the paper that I told you about on the earned income tax credit. So we have microdata on a registry of microdata on births in the United States going back to 1968. It's one of the few registries that we have that goes back that far in the US. And so we use that data, and on the registry, you know where the place of birth is. And so we can map this county access to food stamps to the place of birth using these birth records. And so what we found is that mothers who were exposed to food stamps, particularly important seemed to be in the third trimester, in a kind of diff and diff design across counties over time, had a lower risk of low birth weight. And this breaks down that finding by different cuts of the birth weight distribution. So 2,500 grams is low birth weight, 1,500 grams is very low birth weight. And we're also showing how these impacts, this is a percent reduction in the incidence of being at that level, how it varies between whites and African Americans. And part of the limitation in this data is we don't know much about the mothers. And so we used race as a proxy for SES because the blacks are on average much more disadvantaged than the whites within counties and across counties. And so what we find is that exposure to this cash-like or nutrition social safety net program led to an improvement in infant health, and particularly at the bottom of the kind of health distribution. So much larger gains at very low birth weights than gains further up, which probably makes sense from about any model you would think about applying to it. And then as one final finding from that, we broke things down a little bit more. There was a lot of discussion in the historical literature that there was a lot of discrimination against African Americans getting access to this new program in the 1950s, like pre-Civil Rights Act and all of that, particularly in the South. So we did some analysis to try to learn a little bit more about that, and what we found is that blacks who lived in counties that were more urban got the largest benefits, which might have been about a take-up story, about an access story, or, I mean, I don't know, it could also have something to do with the nature of the population. So, you know, why might food stamps matter? Well, on the one hand, it seems like even though this policy provides food vouchers, most of the evidence we have suggests that people don't seem to treat it very differently than ordinary income. So it's an analysis of having more income. But there is some work that sort of looks at how nutritional intake changes when you've got this food stamp benefit, which might add some additional argument for how nutrition might be a particular channel that's important for this, thinking about what this program might do. What we've done in our most recent paper on this is take that rollout of food stamps to the long run. And so we've got this county variation. We've got this 10 to 15 year period of when the program was rolled out across counties. And now, of course, more time has elapsed since those policies were implemented. And what we've done most recently is use that to evaluate how exposure to food stamps in early life leads to differences in economic and health outcomes in kind of middle adulthood, given the timing of the cohorts that are affected. We look at both economic outcomes and health outcomes. And I probably don't need to say very much of this because I sort of talked about the fetal origins hypothesis earlier, why early life exposure to better nutrition through food stamps might lead to improvements in health in adulthood are very much a kind of straight line connection to this fetal origins hypothesis argument. So with better nutrition in early life, we would have this prediction that there'd be a lower risk of metabolic syndrome in adulthood, and possibly better health, economic outcomes from kinds of mechanisms that maybe better health makes you able to take advantage of your schooling opportunities more. The mechanisms are where I think we need to do more work. I don't have a lot to say about that today. So we use the panel study of income dynamics. We kind of need to wait till these guys are old enough to be eligible for Medicare, our health program, public health insurance, but doesn't kick in till age 65, as you all know. We don't have good registry data in those sort of intervening years. So, and these guys aren't old enough yet. So we use the panel study of income dynamics that is small, so it's not ideal, but it does, because of its longitudinal intergenerational structure, we're able to take people who are adults near the end of the period, say 2010, 2012, 2015, and we know the family conditions they were born into, because that's the nature of the sample, and we can construct groups that we think would be more affected by a policy like this by looking at, say, the educational attainment of their parents. And we do that, and we construct two different indices of outcomes, one a metabolic syndrome index and one an economic well-being index. And you can see the variables that we include in those indices in sort of z-scored way. And our main finding is for metabolic syndrome. And so this is an event study version of the results. And let me sort of walk you through it. Like any event study, everything is going to be relative to some year. And we just chose age 10 to be the reference year. We went into the study not really having a strong prior about when age should matter, but we chose one, age 10. And so as you move to the left, is the horizontal axis is how old were you when food stamps was implemented in your county. So this still comes down to a diff and diff design across counties and across cohorts. Birth cohorts is where the identification comes from. But so as you move to the, and then the outcome variable is metabolic syndrome, which is bad, so a reduction in that is good. So as we move to the left, you're moving to an individual who's exposed earlier and earlier in their childhood to this new program. And what you can see is that up until around age 4 or 5, there's no additional value of having greater exposure to food stamps. But once you get to that sort of preschool age, there's a remarkably linear relationship that shows that one more year of exposure to food stamps leads to a reduction in metabolic syndrome. And it's about, a point, and these are in standard deviation units. So they're not small, they're quite large. And then when you get all the way over to the farthest left-hand part of the graph, we're looking at years, whether food stamps was implemented 3 years before you were born or 5 years before you were born, et cetera. And we wouldn't expect to see anything happening in that range. That shouldn't matter. And so there's a kind of additional test. This is the real common trends test that you're looking for, which becomes very flat. So it's not just some kind of overall trend that's going on. And so the punchline from this is that providing this food voucher or cash assistance program, particularly in utero through around age 4 or 5, leads to quite dramatic improvements in metabolic syndrome in adulthood, which again, it is obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, all of that. And the only variable that individually, if you unpack that and say, well, which one of those things is obesity is the one that really is the one that shows up as being individually statistically significant. The incidence of these other things, diabetes, high blood pressure, and so on, for someone in their 50s is still pretty low. So we don't know what this is going to mean for the longer run. It's just what we know today. We also looked at economic outcomes, and we found that overall for men and women together, we found no effect of this intervention on economic outcomes. But when we broke things up by gender, so that's in the furthest right part, and these are just the point estimates, not the event studies, we found a zero, like literally zero and not statistically significant effect for the men, but a quite substantial and positive effect for women, which I can't fully explain why that is occurring, though it does seem to be something that shows up in many educational interventions of greater benefits for girls than for boys, but this isn't an educational intervention. So, if I come back in a year from now, I'll hope to be able to show you some more evidence on this, where thanks to the shoe leather of my co-author Martha Bailey, we've basically got the 2000 census, the 20% sample of that, so 1 in 5 Americans, or about 43 million people, and we've made an agreement where we've merged that data with our Social Security Administration data that is the keeper of the place of birth information. And we've merged that in and basically assigned place of birth to this much bigger, better sample. And so we're now working on doing a similar analysis to measure, again, the effects of early life exposure to food stamps and its relationship to other programs and economic conditions and a whole lot of other stuff on the things that are measured in the census. Not metabolic health, but rich education, family structure, where you live. We also can observe mortality and things of that sort. So stay tuned for that. So let me just briefly tell you about this work on Medicaid, and then I'll wrap up. So Medicaid is the main, we don't have universal health insurance in the United States, but we do have a very big government sector, but it feeds two populations, the elderly and the disabled, but also children and sometimes their mothers, pre-Obamacare kind of expansion. And quite under the radar to most people's knowledge, actually starting under the first President Bush in the late 1980s, there was a major expansion in public health insurance for children. It used to be that you would only get public health insurance if you were on welfare. And there was all this concern about the so-called welfare lock. And if you have all these benefits that you stack on top of cash welfare, that it only kind of perpetuates the difficulty of moving from welfare into work. And so the very beginning of that sort of unraveling of the cash welfare system, out-of-work welfare system, was to try to move Medicaid beyond just welfare recipients. And eventually, all children under age 18 living in families up to like 130% of the poverty line were covered by public health insurance. And many states went much further than that, went up to 200 or 300% of the poverty line. So there was this incredibly rich period over the 1980s and 1990s that this program, which is essentially kind of controlled by the states, was expanding at different rates across different states for different groups, that has created this incredibly vast literature of work on the effects of public health insurance on X, Y, and Z. And so this graph just gives you just the time series of the uninsured rate for poor children compared to not poor or near poor children over this 20-year period, just to show the dramatic reduction in the lack of not having health insurance. And there's 3 different research designs that have been used in the literature to study the effects of Medicaid. One is like my food stamps work and looks at the origins of the Medicaid program, which were rolled out by state, not by county, but by state in the late 1960s. So there's a set of studies there that, of course, can follow people over a much longer period of time because it's been 35 years since that, if I just did that, no, longer than that, whatever the amount of time, long time since that period. And then the other two research designs, which are really more the modern day Medicaid expansions, use two different designs. One of them are basically RD-like designs, regression discontinuity designs, that leverage the fact that there was a line drawn in the birth cohorts that all of these expansions I just told you about only held for people who were born after September 30th, 1983, which I think was the date that the policy was passed, or something like that. And the second design is kind of a state year panel design that uses variation in the rate at which states did this expansion across how old the children were, how far up the income distribution, and so on. I'm not going to go into the details of those designs, but those three kinds of ways of looking at this have generated a lot of work. And so to sort of describe that work in a little bit of a life cycle lens here, what we know is that greater access to health insurance, this is health insurance, not income, when a child is young, leads to better self-reported. The first study on this was by Janet Curry and co-authors that showed better self-reported health in the late teen years. More recently, using registry data, Laura Wary and Bruce Meyer show that having greater access to health insurance as a child leads to a reduction, I'll show you that figure, in mortality in late teen years for African American boys. No, this is just boys and girls together. And so you can see there's this point here in October 1, 1993, the group of kids born after that had access to much more public health insurance compared to the group before. And you can see a quite remarkable decline in deaths from internal causes. So, not violence and so on. That is quite dramatic. There's also additional work that follows these kids a little bit further along that shows differences, a reduction sort of in early adulthood, further reductions in mortality along the lines of what I just showed you. Also, reductions in admissions to the hospital for chronic conditions, lower obesity and hospitalization. This isn't contemporaneous. This is later on. So it's not just I have health insurance and that changes what I can do today, but it's looking at it as more as a health outcome down the road. And then most dramatically, to me anyways, is these few studies by Sarah Cajotes et al. And Amanda Kowalski and co-authors that show that more access to public health insurance leads to better educational attainment, more health insurance as a child, leads to increases in educational attainment and everything that derives from that, better earnings, more tax revenues, and so on. So it's kind of remarkable, I think. And this is just kind of an exploding area where a lot of people are doing a lot of work because there's been so much change in public health insurance. This is another figure from that sort of RD-like research design that looks at the impact of childhood eligibility on hospitalizations for, as you can see, African Americans in their 20s. And you can see a quite dramatic reduction in hospitalization as a young adult due to having more insurance as a child. These are like things that actually quantify into being important potential benefits in the long run, not just for the individual, but for society, given that so much of the cost of healthcare is incurred by the public in some way or another. So there is also some work from this Medicaid rollout that looks over a longer period of time for example, shows a reduction in chronic conditions in adulthood. And more recently, Andrew Goodman Bacon has done some work that looks at things like adult mortality, disability in adulthood, as well as employment in adulthood, and finds beneficial effects of this earlier 1960 introduction of public health insurance for the kind of welfare population. So, you know, just one little bonus slide. It occurred to me that one thing I left out, where we also have some new evidence that sort of fits into this, comes from our housing benefits. And the work there seems to be a little bit more mixed. There's a really excellent study by Brian Jacob and Jens Ludwig that leverages a lottery that took place in Chicago when they made some new housing vouchers available. And about 3 times as many vouchers were available. People showed up to want to get the housing vouchers, and they they randomized who ended up getting the vouchers. And so they have these great papers with a very good design. And it took place some time ago in the 90s. And so they had data on following the children of those that won the lottery over 14 years of follow-up. And what they find is nothing. They've got good administrative data. They have education outcomes, test scores, criminal justice earnings. They're still young-ish. So it's possible that there could be something in the longer run that doesn't show up in the sort of childhood time period. But that's finding basically a null effect of a program that actually has a lot of value. And then there's the recent work by Chetty et al. On the Moving to Opportunity housing experiment. And it's possible that part of the takeaway of this, particularly with respect to housing benefits, that the Moving to Opportunity study really illuminates is that you might, in order to get the benefits of these housing benefits, it really matters where you move to. And in the Chicago study, basically households got the housing vouchers, but we're still living in very poor neighborhoods. And in the Moving to Opportunity study, they were able to evaluate the requirement that to get the voucher, you need to move to a better neighborhood, as quantified by the study, and found that much bigger effects in the long run of this benefit if you had the voucher that incentivized moving to a better neighborhood. They also found that it really mattered when you moved. So kids that moved when they were young got strong benefits in the long run, earnings and so on. But kids that moved when they were older, if anything, showed an adverse effect of moving in the long run. So the results seem to be a little bit more complicated for housing vouchers. So where we're at, I think, is only the beginning. But it looks to me as though the evidence that we have suggests that there's a quantifiable sort of long-run benefit to these programs that we sort of typically analyze and typically in a much sort of shorter-term lens. And I think, as I say up on the slide, that I think that the next generation of work, we need to learn more about mechanisms, like why is this happening? We need to try to maybe get a little bit more serious about building up some kind of cost-benefit analysis to get some kind of an idea about whether these benefits that we're quantifying, how much do they sort of account for the cost of these programs? Learn more about for whom and when the benefits matter, and learn more a little bit about the different kinds of interventions and how they translate to different kinds of rates of return in the long run. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very thoughtful, informative lecture. Very stimulating research agenda also for the upcoming years. There's some time for questions. Yeah.
So the starting point with the exposure to famine in utero and later life, I mean, to some extent that can be perceived as sort of more like a technical relationship. Whereas many of the things that you are looking at here, you're giving income to families and looking at the children's outcomes, that has to be mediated through the behavior of the parents. But yet, you hardly mention parents' behavior in your talk. And to some extent, do we have to believe that that is sort of constant from the time we started the introduction of these programs to be valid to making policy recommendations today?
Yeah.
So what's your thinking on thinking about parents' behavior in this context?
Yeah, that is a very notable absence of what I had in there, and I think that's a very good point to make. I think part of it is my own, I mean, I think most of the work starts with the parents, because what's the first thing we usually do when we evaluate a program like this? What do we usually measure as the outcome? Like labor supply of the recipient. That's like the first order thing we usually do, and our studies are usually kind of organized around what's the moral hazard. So I think we know something about that. We don't know a whole lot beyond that. There is a little bit of work here and there using like time use studies to try to understand, well, in addition to us kind of the typical thing we do as labor economists of looking at labor supply, could we look at other kinds of things to find out when we do different kinds of interventions, social safety net, how does that translate into what parents are doing? So I think I could enrich that a little bit, but you're right, I've kind of left that out here. I think about that as sort of an important mitigating factor of understanding how much of a benefit the household actually gets. But certainly, and some of these interventions are just not very targeted towards changing parents' behavior writ large, but I mean, I think you're right. I think I could add some of that here, but there's a lot of holes in that as well. But I think that's a good thing to bring up. More work to be done.
Thanks for the talk, Hilary. I have a very related question, which is that in the recent literature on trying to understand the drivers of obesity and in trying to understand what kind of policy interventions might work there, people have been interested in the effect of cash transfers, income transfers to households and the effects they may have. And my understanding of that literature and what it shows is that the income effects actually go the other way, that if you give more income to low SES households, what tends to happen, what you see in the data is that you get a decline in nutritional of the nutritional characteristics of what the households purchase in terms of food in the very short run.
Right.
And that's been interpreted as saying that there's not income effects, it's preference heterogeneity, at least in the short run.
Right.
And so I think that speaks very much to how do we, what are the mechanisms? And so do we think here there's some longer term mechanisms that maybe, longer term cash transfers raise income and change preferences in the longer run? Or is the world changed since this was in the 60s or something?
Right. I think that, it's interesting because I think it was you who told me about this work that I actually didn't know about. And first of all, there's not that much good evidence on causal effects of income on nutrition. I mean, they're hard to get. There's just not that many experiments that deliver that. I need to be influenced by this because my prior was that there are income effects on that not nutritious food is a lot cheaper than nutritious food. That we know. That's just factual in terms of what it costs to buy fresh fruit and vegetables versus junk food or whatever. So that's surprising to me, to be honest. But I do think, one of the downsides of this deeply historical work is that, where it's very clear if you look in the day, part of what launched the food stamp program was that President Kennedy, when he was running for president, visited these poor parts of America he'd never been to and was kind of blown away by the sort of abject hunger that he saw. And then there was this big public TV documentary called Hunger in America, and that seemed to be what sort of got Congress shamed into passing the original act. So it's clear that the initial conditions were different there, and I don't know what to say about that. It's a kind of massive asterisk on the whole thing to say, well, but what else do you do? If you want to look in the long run, you have to go back in time. So it's a little bit of a puzzle, I think. So I appreciate provoking me to think about it more.
Yeah, over there in the back. Yeah.
So my question is about the current context. Given the economic policies are changing, what is the likely effect of the current policies on this safety net?
Oh, what's happening with these policies?
Yeah, what do you speculate, or what are your assessment?
Yeah. The policy in the U.S. context that's the kind of safest politically is the Earned Income Tax Credit, mostly because it is a work promoting benefit program. And it's much easier to get broader support for a policy that is work encouraging rather than work discouraging. And I would say that food stamps, well, before the Congress was unable to pass the repeal of Obamacare, I would have said Medicaid, but they weren't too successful with that. But food stamps is something that is the one element of the basic social welfare safety net in America that has not been cut back. And so I think it is at the most risk because of the general lack of consensus about the desire to do out-of-work assistance in America, which is discouraging, but that's where there's less consensus.
Okay, I have time for more questions. Okay.
The intergenerational aspects of this, so that those who have, in their early childhood, received benefit from these various programs, what is the effect on their children following on? Because one of the things is the intergenerational poverty, and does it actually lift people out of that poverty trap?
Yeah, there's people working on that right now. I know there's studies going on with respect to food stamps. Also, I think the introduction of Head Start program, our preschool program. So I think in a way you could say that a little bit when you look at birth weight. That's like the first thing you could look at in an intergenerational sense. But I know that Andrew Goodman Bacon, who did the work on the historical rollout of Medicaid, is now working on looking at the next generation. So I think that we'll know about that soon, but I don't know anything yet. But I think that's the way that I think the work is kind of broadening and then also extending further out in the life cycle across generations.
Okay, I would like to thank you once more for your very interesting lecture and for the additional comments.
Thank you very much.
I would like to give the floor to Sarah Smith for some final words.
So I promise not to take too long. So Andrew began by welcoming you all to this conference. I'm just going to end with a word of thanks, or a few words of thanks. So I'd like to reinforce the thanks already given to Michael, the Deputy Programme Chair, Shania Leandro's local organisers, who really must take most of the credit for the smooth running of this conference, the Programme Committee, Neil, Joe, Narusha, and the fantastic conference assistants. So I'd also like to thank all the speakers at the Keynote, Plenary, Special and General sessions. They've all been fantastic. We had quite a lively debate on Monday about the state of economics in the UK post-Brexit. And I think this conference really has confirmed that the state of economics in the UK is very much kind of alive and well. I think it's confirmed the strength and relevance of economics in the UK. There was a very nice article in The Independent which covered a range of the research that we've had at this conference. And it had a headline, the everyday economics that could have a hugely positive impact on society. So that's someone looking at what we've been doing at this conference and seeing that it really has something to deliver, not just to the people here, but beyond. There's possibly an even better quote from one of the public events. So alongside the academic conference, we've been getting academics to reach out to members of the public. So Monday, Tuesday, and tonight, we've had public events. So you never really know how these are going to go. And like members of the public turn up and they ask questions. And we certainly weren't expecting the following question, which is, why do we hear so much from the idiot politicians and not from experts like you? So I thought that was fantastic. I mean, and we didn't even post it. It was completely unscripted. So in the ref session, if you were there, Andrew Oswald reminded us that we would be lucky if we were remembered for one thing, or we might be just remembered for just one thing. So possibly my legacy is going to be getting the presidential triumvirate onto the dance floor at the same time. But hopefully you'll also remember a really great conference with lots of great research and great talks. And I do hope you'll come back to Sussex for more of it next year. So thank you very much for coming. I wish you a safe journey home and see some of you next year for the RES conference, for Peter's RES conference next year. So thank you very much.